Namaskar. We will be continuing with our discussion on the sociological influences on consumer decision making, and today we shall be talking about culture, subculture and cross culture. In this particular module 7.5, we shall be covering it in a total of 2 hours. We shall be discussing the meaning of culture, the characteristics of culture, the components of culture, the measurement of culture, the meaning of subculture, the types of subculture, the exposure to other cultures. We shall be talking about cross-cultural consumer analysis, and we will talk about the applications of cross-cultural consumer analysis as relevant to a marketer. We will be talking about strategies for multinational companies, and we will be discussing the relevance of culture for a marketer. In today's session, we will be talking about the meaning of culture, the characteristics of culture, the components of culture, the measurement of culture, the meaning of subculture and the types of subculture. So, let us begin with our discussion on culture. Now, when we talk about culture, in a nutshell, in one line definition, it is actually the personality of a society. It is something which is very broad, very pervasive in nature, so as to include everything that relates to our existence in the social fabric. It could relate to the language, the customs, the traditions, the various value systems, the norms, the matters with respect to religion, matters with respect to art, music, law, any of these. So, it is something which is very broad, which is very persuasive in nature, and as such it includes the interests of people, the general interests, the specific interests, their work orientations and their attitudes, opinions, judgments, values and beliefs with respect to anything general in the environment or anything specific in the environment. So, it could relate to either general issues or it could relate to specific issues, and all of this basically characterizes the social fabric of our existence. So, we call this as the personality of society, and we refer to it as culture. Now, culture basically defines very clearly the do's and don'ts of a society. It explains what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, what are the yeses in the society and what are the no's in the society. So, the do's, the don'ts, the norms of acceptable and unacceptable behavior or standards of behavior are very well defined in the context of culture. It is also reflective of the values, it is also reflective of the beliefs that are widely accepted by members of a social system. So, the members of a social system subscribe to various values, beliefs, norms, and all of this basically gives more strength, gives more power to culture and to the impact that culture wields over the members in the community. Now, while culture is something which is where people subscribe to, and so it gives there's some amount of strength, there's some amount of power associated with culture and cultural norms. Nevertheless, it is not something which is static. It is not truly rigid. It changes with time. It evolves itself. It adapts itself to the changing environment. And so we see transition in culture. We see changes in culture which happen over a period of time. Culture is the society's personality, and it is something which is very unique in itself. It is something which differentiates it from members of one social system to members of another social system. And culture gets divided into subcultures, and subcultures give distinct identities to people of certain communities or certain castes, or to people across certain regions or states. So, we say that while we have culture which in a broader sense prescribes the values and norms of people belonging to culture, the subculture is more specific to people of certain regions or to certain communities and certain castes, and that forms a part of their subculture. Culture is also transgenerational, as it passes from one generation to other. It passes on from the grandparents to our parents, and from our parents to us, and from us to our offspring. So, it is passed from generation to generation, and that's why we say that culture is transgenerational. So, a study of our culture requires a very detailed and an elaborate inquiry into the very nature, into the very characteristic and into the very personality of the culture that we live in. So, when we talk about culture, when you talk about subculture, and when we talk about cultures in terms of cross cultures or cross cultures, we are talking of a certain inquiries that we make into the value system or the behavioral patterns of people in one culture vis-a-vis the subculture vis-a-vis other cultures. So it is basically an inquiry into the very character, into the very personality, and into the very identity, into a social fabric that we live in. So the study of culture requires a detailed inquiry into the very identity of one's culture, the distinctiveness, the unique personality, and the character of the society that we actually live in. So the culture of the society has an impact on general norms of behavior, on our specific norms of behavior, and they also have an impact to number of other behavioral patterns that we exhibit, even and that's how we include consumer behavior. So the study of if you see culture and subculture and cross culture also has an impact on marketing, has an impact on consumption patterns, has an impact on consumer behavior, and that is why we study it as a sociological influence on consumer decision making. So in terms of culture, or in terms of subculture, and in terms of cross cultures, the marketers have to draw upon a lot of bearings to basically talk about how things are, how the identity, how the nature, how the characteristic, how the personality of one society changes to another, and that has a bearing on what marketers have to do with respect to designing their marketing program, whether it is the segmentation or targeting or positioning that they look into, or whether they look into the more specific marketing program in terms of the 4 Ps. So they have to keep these their strategies in mind while dealing with people of different cultures, subcultures, and cross cultures. So the culture of a society has a bearing on our buying patterns, on our consumption behavior. And in terms of consumer behavior, Schiffman says that culture is the sum total of learned beliefs, values, and customs that serve to direct the consumer behavior of members of a particular society. So it is a sum total of learned beliefs, values, and customs that direct the consumer behavior of members in a social system or members in a particular society. So the kind of products and services people buy, the kind of products and services they use, or the brands they buy and use, are all based on the culture and the subcultures, or the impact of the cross culture that comes upon them. For example, the kind of food that we eat, the kind of clothes that we wear, the kind of this is more to do with general, but in terms of specific, the kind of brands that we buy, the kind of shops that we go in, the kind of shopping orientation that we have, all of these basically are greatly impacted by the culture and subculture. So it's not only the general norms which say the food we eat or the dresses we wear, but it's also the more specific consumption pattern in terms of the brands we buy, the price we pay, the orientation with which we approach the marketplace, the kind of stores that we buy, go into, the kind of negotiation that we enter into in terms of price, etc. All of it is impacted by one's own culture and subcultures, and also impacted by the cross-cultural influences. Now let us come to discuss the characteristics of culture. So we will see that while we talk about the culture as a personality of a society, and while we just agreed upon the fact that culture basically illustrates the identity or the personality or the nature or the characteristics of the society, we basically have certain other elements which characterize what culture is. So let us talk about these characteristics. The first is culture is natural and permeates naturally into the social system. So culture is something which we are born into, and it inbreds into the members of a social system. It is all pervasive. It permeates naturally into the social system. So it will influence the manner in which we behave, either consciously or subconsciously, and how the manner in which we behave, either with specific general norms of behavior or specific norms of behavior, the kind of mannerisms we exhibit, the kind of behavior that we indulge into, is all consciously and subconsciously affected by our cultural norms. So culture basically impacts the way people behave in the society. So our values, our opinions, our lifestyles, our judgments, our opinions, everything about us, are the religious customs, the traditions, the religion that we practice, or the value system that we possess, everything is affected, is a part of culture, and it affects our general and our specific norms of behavior. So the culture affects the manner in which we behave in a society, either consciously or subconsciously. Everything is impacted by culture. It also unites the members of a social system. So these do's, these don'ts, these norms of behavior, whether general or specific acts of behavior, all of them act as certain principles which guide the society or the social system through. And as they act, they act as guides or do's and don'ts, they also act as a unifying force amongst members of a social system. So because people know what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, because people know what is right and what is wrong, they indulge into certain kinds of behaviors and they avoid certain other kinds of behaviors. So this basically acts as a binding force where people follow certain norms, and this uniformity of action, uniformity of thought actually binds the people in a social fabric together. So in terms of consumer behavior, the kind of food we eat, the clothes we wear, of course, are all impacted by culture, by the socialization process that we go through. We have discussed in the previous sessions the socialization process for a child, for an adult, and across generations. So we spoke of child socialization, adult socialization, and transgenerational socialization. We also spoke about the family of procreation and the family of orientation, and how both of these have an impact on the socialization process. So this entire socialization process is actually impacted by culture. Culture, in fact, acts as a foundation for this. And so the kind of clothes we wear, the kind of food we eat, the kind of purchases that we make are all going to be impacted by culture. Culture encompasses the general as well as the specific acts of behavior, and this behavior also includes consumption behavior. The second characteristic of culture is that culture helps in satisfaction of needs. In fact, culture exists to satisfy needs of people. Our beliefs, values, customs, traditions, all of these basically govern the social system and specify the manner in which people have to behave in the social fabric or in the social system. They clearly spell out the do's, the don'ts, whatever is acceptable norms of behavior or the unacceptable norms of behavior are clearly specified by the social system. And these values, norms, beliefs, customs, traditions, they all exist because they serve a particular purpose. In fact, as long as they serve a purpose, they continue to exist, and as and when they lose their importance in terms of fulfillment of certain purposes, they begin to fade away or they begin to change off, and cultural adaptation takes place or cultural change comes about. So as long as these values, beliefs, opinions, customs, traditions, they meet the needs of the people of the society, they will continue, and gradually they will fade off or they will change. So that is why we say that culture evolves over the passage of time. It evolves with time, and as people as the needs of people undergo change, as the needs of people evolve, similarly the values, beliefs, opinions, judgments, customs, traditions will also change, and so as to match the satisfaction of needs. So needs, basically it is the satisfaction of needs which is prime, and culture exists basically to support the satisfaction of needs. So a culture thus helps in the satisfaction of needs. Marketers must be very conscious of newly developed and embraced values, customs and traditions so as to be able to take advantage of such a situation. For example, lately developed consciousness of people towards fashion has given a boost to the fashion industry, the apparel industry and the accessories. Also, people consciousness towards fitness has led to a boost to gymnasium and the sports business, and people's consciousness towards health has given rise to a lot of natural products like fruit juices, honey, use of aloe vera, etc. So culture basically exists to meet satisfaction of needs as and how the needs evolve, the cultural norms change, the pattern changes, and as we said, with changes in time, people will exhibit different values, and this will have an impact on the marketer, who has to come up with newer product or service offerings. He has to come up with different pricing strategies has to come up with changes in his distribution channel and even in his communication mix, so as to get adapted to culture and so as to get into congruence with cultural issues of people. Communication, in fact, or promotion is extremely important in this case, where marketer has to evolve his messages as per the needs, the wants, the values, the opinions, the beliefs of the people in the social system. So while people consciousness towards newer products like fashion or sport, health and fitness, or towards use of natural products has given a boost to different kinds of industries. Similarly, we do see in our day-to-day lifestyles the kind of message strategy that has been adopted by companies, the kind of creative strategy that is adopted by companies in terms of for their communication mix also undergoes a change. So this has relevance for a marketer as far as his 4 Ps are concerned. The next characteristic of culture is that culture is not inborn. It is something which is learned as a part of the socialization process. So we have discussed socialization, which starts from the childhood and begins throughout life. It is impacted by the social culture is impacted by the socialization process. Now, the learning of culture can be of 2 kinds: enculturation and acculturation. The process of learning one's own culture is referred to as enculturation, and the process of learning another culture or culture of a neighboring country or a neighboring or another country, so to say, or another continent, so as to say, becomes a part of the acculturation. So learning one's own native culture is enculturation, and learning other people's cultures, foreign cultures, becomes a part of acculturation. Now, enculturation and acculturation also have implications for a marketer. It's very easy for a marketer to enculturate himself because he's a part of the culture, he's a part of the socialization process, he's a part of the social fabric. But when it comes to, but still he has to be very careful that the manner in which he designs his product, the way in which he positions it, the way in which he uses an appeal for them should not hurt the sentiments of people in his culture. It has to be well within the limits prescribed as the do's and don'ts of the social fabric of culture. Even more relevant is cross culture, or is the process of acculturation, how that has an impact on the marketer. Marketers have to be very, very careful with respect to decisions taken with product, with respect to decisions related to price or to distribution or to promotion. Any of the 4 Ps, primarily, most importantly, communication, or the 4th P, promotion. Marketers have to be very careful that they design such product and service offerings, and they price them, or they sell them, or they promote them in a manner which is in congruence with people of other cultures. So they cannot afford to hurt the sentiments or the feelings or the thought processes of people of other cultures. So it's very important that they go through this process of acculturation. So the process of learning a foreign culture, the process of learning another culture, is extremely relevant for for a marketer. Now, coming back to how culture is learned, we have discussed in terms of socialization, the child socialization, the adult socialization, and the transgenerational socialization, and we agree that culture is something which we learn across our life. We are impacted by our family, we are impacted by our friends, we are impacted by people in the social fabric, and this cultural learning basically could take 3 forms. One is a formal learning, the other is an informal learning, and the third is the technical learning. So learning of culture here could assume 3 forms: a formal learning, informal learning, and technical learning. When a child is taught how to behave, with the do's, the don'ts, the rights, the wrongs, the acceptable modes of behavior, the unacceptable modes of behavior, by family members, by grandparents, by parents, and by siblings, we call it an informal learning. So here people are learning culture or part of their culture in terms of customs, traditions, language, religion, and the rest of it from one's own immediate family, from the parents, from the grandparents, and from the siblings. So it's a informal learning that is taking place, and we call it so it's a formal learning which is taking place, and we call it the formal structured way of learning from our parents or from our grandparents. There's another kind of learning which takes place, which is called the informal learning, which takes place when people imitate others. They look to others, they imitate the behavior of others, and these others could be members again of their family, or they could be members, they could be neighbors, or they could be friends, or they could be celebrities, or they could be any kind of character. So this kind of learning which takes place through observation and through replication of this behavior, or through copying of this behavior, or modeling of this behavior, through imitation, we call it informal learning. So when a family correctly, clearly specifies what is right, what is wrong, and teaches that to the child, that kind of learning is called the formal learning. And when the child observes and imitates, that kind of learning is called the informal learning. There's another kind of learning that takes place where a child is taught how to behave in a formal educational environment. So that kind of learning becomes a technical learning. So culture is learned either in the form of formal learning or informal learning, or it could be learnt in the form of technical learning. So as consumers, it is through our culture that we learn to buy certain kinds of products and services, to use them in a particular fashion or in a particular manner, and to buy from certain stores or certain malls, or to buy certain brands and not to buy other brands. The art of negotiation, our very own concept or perception of increased price or decreased price, or very expensive and inexpensive. Again, this kind of an orientation also comes from this learning that takes place. Our orientation in terms of whether we should go for a price orientation, or whether we should go for a quality orientation, that is whether we should buy the product with the lowest price or with the highest price or the best quality. Again, all these are certain things which we imbibe as we see our parents or our grandparents or members of a family and friends behave in the marketplace. So it is through a culture that we learn what we should buy and what we should not buy, what is desirable purchase behavior and what is undesirable purchase behavior. Similar is with respect to what kind of brands we should buy and what kind of brands we should avoid. Our perception about brands is influenced informally by our family, by our friends, by our colleagues. It is also influenced formally by the marketer who communicates with the consumer either directly through a salesperson or personal selling efforts, or indirectly through advertising either in print or audiovisual broadcast media. So both formally and informally we communicate amongst each other, formally with the marketer and informally with our family, with our friends, and that too also acts as a as a basis about how we will perceive brands. So the kind of products we buy, the kind of services we buy, or the kind of brands we buy are all influenced by culture. Now, this is with respect to how culture is learned, and more specific with the enculturation process. But what do we talk about the acculturation process? Acculturation is to do with learning of a foreign culture. So you have to basically learn something new, afresh, with respect to another culture. So the language, the customs, the traditions, the religious practices, the values, the opinions, the norms, the behaviorals of people from other societies, from other cultures is something which is very important and is referred to as the process of acculturation. This is important specifically for multinational companies and for marketing managers of such multinational organizations. So MNCs who wish to enter into newer markets, enter into newer countries, must go through this process of acculturation. If they wish to introduce a product or service offering of a brand and want to get quickly accepted by the social system there or by the people there, it's very important that they go through this process of acculturation. So they should carefully study the cultures, they should carefully understand the cultures of such countries. They have to go through an elaborate process of acculturation so that they can understand the inhabitants of such cultures in terms of their language, their customs, their traditions, their religious sentiments, and also they would be able to understand them better in terms of their need, want pattern, so as to give them an answer to the question that is this particular country suitable enough as a segment, or is it viable enough for a segment, or will it be worthwhile entering such a country and treating it as a market segment. So the marketers have to basically go through this process of acculturation so that they can understand the people of such cultures, and then they can understand their needs and wants, and decide whether it would be worthwhile entering into such markets or entering into such segments. So also they should be able to design their 4 Ps accordingly, keeping in mind the customs, keeping in mind the traditions, the value systems, and other cultural norms and of that particular country, of that particular social system, so that they can gain easy acceptance, so that they can gain quicker acceptance. Because in order to be accepted quickly, in order to be first, in order to be welcome somewhere, and second, in order to be accepted very quickly, it's very important that you behave like them, or you become like them. So in order to behave like people of other cultures and become like them, it's very important that you go through this process of acculturation. So MNCs who desire to enter new markets and they wish to introduce their product and service offerings and want a quicker acceptance of their product or brand in that particular country, they should carefully study the cultures of foreign countries where they want to enter, and they should have a proper understanding of such cultures. The next characteristic of culture is that culture is shared. It is something which is accepted by people of a social unit, by people of the social system, and it ties the people of the social system together. As I just said a little while ago, the very fact that people share certain values, opinions, judgments, beliefs, the very fact that they understand what is right, what is wrong, what are the acceptable forms of behavior, what is unacceptable, what is do's and what are don'ts. So the very fact that they understand all this, share all this, and this becomes a common route for them to develop upon. So that also means that it's going to lead to greater unity between them, and people are going to share this culture and be known as as being sharing a particular cultural characteristic. So it is, the culture binds the people together. People share culture, and so culture is something which is shared. Social institutions like family, educational institutions like schools, colleges, and universities, political institutions like the public or the policy makers or the leaders or government, and other religious institutions, whether it be places of worship or artifacts or religious leaders, all of them basically help in transmitting culture. All of them help in transferring cultural components to each other, and thereby they help in transmitting culture across members of a social fabric. So in this way we say that culture is something which is shared. Also, a big role is played by the mass media. The mass media, either in the form of the print media or in the form of the audio visual broadcast media, also has a role to play in transmitting culture. So we say culture is something which is shared. It binds the people of a society together and gives them a unified, makes them feel a unified whole. And this culture is learned, it is transferred, it is transmitted by social institutions, or by religious institutions, or by political institutions, or by educational institutions, and they all help transmit culture. Also, the mass media or the TV, the radio, and the newspaper also help in transmitting of ideas, of values, of beliefs across people in a social system, and they all help in sharing of culture. So that is why we say that culture is something which is shared. Also today, cultures and subcultures are shared with people within and outside. Mass media has a big role to play with a vast large number of television channels vying for viewership across India, and that gets reflected in their TRP ratings. The various soaps, the various serials reflect how people are sharing culture and how people are getting closer. So the various channels, through their soaps, through their serials, they reflect the cultures of all kinds. They portray joint families, large joint families. They portray small nuclear families. They portray different types of cultures and subcultures. So across a television channel, you can see a serial which portrays a Gujarati family, and another serial which portrays a Punjabi family, and another serial which which portrays a Bengali family. All these serials to be coming one after the other between 8:30 and 10 o'clock. So it is basically what people are getting exposed to is newer cultures, newer subcultures rather, and people are becoming aware of eating patterns, dressing patterns, the languages, the religious customs, the traditions of people across countries. So subculture and culture is fast spreading, and people are sharing different components of culture and subculture. Also, with the various national and vernacular channels that we have in India, we have begun a process where we share subcultures even more, and subcultures are no longer restricted to geographical boundaries. It is through TV, through radio, through magazines, and through the newspapers we are exposed to different cultures and subcultures every day. So subcultures are no longer restricted to geographical boundaries, and as a viewer, as a person who watches serials, I may come to know about a lot about customs and traditions of people of another culture or another subculture, and I begin to also try to learn few things in terms of dressing patterns, or in terms of eating habits, or in terms of eating styles. So there, as for example, like today there is a great demand for dhokla and khakra, which were essentially Gujarati food, and this demand is there in North India. Similarly, you have a great demand for mishti doi and for rasgulla or for hilsa fish in South India. So something which was essentially Gujarati food as a dhokla or khakra, which was restricted to Gujarat and some parts of maybe Maharashtra, have now moved beyond to North India, where people want to relish such delicacies. And the market again has a huge potential, where these kind of restaurants have started getting opened. So you find Gujarati restaurants even in North India. Similarly, you have the Bengali delicacies like the hilsa fish, or the rasgulla, or the sandesh, or the mishti doi, which is getting very, very popular across country and across South India or even North India, where people want such delicacies. So the market again has a huge potential. So we today find packed dhokla and khakra, and we also find rasagullas and sandesh in gift wrapped packs, often tinned or in plastic jars and cans, which is easy to carry across the country, and people buy. They're available across the country, and even if they are not, they can be easily carried from one part of the country if one is on a tour, on a travel, and to another part of the country to be relished in his home with his family. So culture today is something which is shared. As consumers, we are greatly impacted by these various forms of like the social or the religious or the political or the religious societies and forums, but we also impacted hugely and immensely by the mass media. Finally, we say culture is dynamic in nature and constantly evolves with time. So it adapts itself to the changing times. Marketers basically need to assess the environment so as to look for the changing needs and wants, preferences and priorities, and so they need to adapt their product or service offerings with the changing needs, changing wants, changing values, norms, behavioral patterns of people in the society. So like for example, we have a dual income household, which is both husband wife working, and what we see today is not a financially constrained or income constrained family unit, but more of a time constrained family unit. So people here today prefer going out and eating. Something which was not seen earlier is today becoming very popular. We find large number of eateries or joints or restaurants that have come up all over, because the demand for fast food, the demand for restaurant food has increased. So with dual income households and the need for eating out, it's a huge business for the fast food and for the restaurant business. So marketers have to be on the lookout for changing values, changing beliefs, changing views, norms, the changing needs and wants pattern of members of a particular culture, and they have to adapt themselves accordingly in terms of their marketing strategy, whether it is in terms of STP, or it is the 4 Ps, or it is in terms of diversifying into other ventures. So all of this we basically impacted by culture. So with change in culture, also what we see today is changing in buying roles. We've discussed buying roles. We've talked about how children, how teenagers are big initiators and influencers, how they are also becoming, they have a big role to play in decision making, how they are also becoming buyers, and the marketers have to identify these the initiators, influencers, deciders, buyers and users, and use them, approach them accordingly, either personally or impersonally via mass media. So marketers basically who continually assess the environment for cultural change would be in a much better way, will be equipped much better to understand the environment and change the 4Ps accordingly. So that's how we say that culture is dynamic and it evolves with time. So these are a few of the characteristics of culture. Now let us move into the components of culture. So what are the various components of culture? Talking about the components, we say that the culture has components like values, language, myths, customs, rituals and law. So these are the various components of culture. It is these which make up a culture, or these which characterize the social fabric of a society. So what are the various components? The various components, or what is it that constitutes culture? It is the values, it is the language, it is the myths, it's the customs and traditions, it is the rituals and it is law. Each of these acts as a constituent of culture. So beginning with values, what is a value? These are beliefs and ideals which are shared by people of a society, for which they get great respect and regard. So these values could assume both a positive and negative form. So positive in terms of the do's and negative in terms of don'ts, and they are basically, these values become indicative of appropriate thoughts, feelings and acts of behavior. So this is what we mean by value. Value is it is the ideal, it is the beliefs that people in a social fabric, people in the society, people in the society must follow. There are certain norms of certain do's, there are certain don'ts, and there are certain acceptable forms of behavior which all actually derive from the values or from the value system. And they are basically, they come in the form of, or they translate themselves in the form of acceptable and unacceptable acts of behavior, very often in terms of the thoughts, the feelings and acts of behavior. The language, as we all know, is a means of how we communicate with people in the social system, and it is language which is very, very strongly binding amongst people across cultures and subcultures. Language is a great binding force. It binds people of a culture together, it binds people of subcultures together, and it is basically this common language that binds them even more stronger in a social structure. Myths are legendary stories or folk tales that describe events and occurrences in the society and teach values to the society or to the members of the social system. So these legendary folk tales or these legendary stories, they basically recount a certain they are in the form of a story of and certain characters, and these characters play certain positive and negative roles, and through the consequences of the negatives, the people in the social system are taught about how not to enact negative characters and how to adopt positive characters. So it is these folk tales or these stories act as they act as lessons which again provide values to or strengthen values in members of a social system. So through these stories, people in a social fabric are taught what is good and what is bad, what happens if you do good things and what happens if you do bad things. So these are essentially imaginary and fictitious in nature, and the characters here could be gods, goddesses, heroes, heroines, or men, the common man, and ultimately the lesson, it basically gives lessons to people with respect to the causes and effects of the good and the bad, or the right and the wrong. So through lessons of good, bad, right, wrong, people in a society are taught what they should be doing and what they should be avoiding. So in a way, essentially they are taught about the value system. Customs are habitual practices that formulate the way of doing things and they reflect the culturally accepted patterns of behavior. People in a particular social system will follow certain practices collectively, and the habitual practices or habitual activity becomes a part of their day-to-day customs, and then it gets transferred from one generation to another. So customs are basically day-to-day acts of behavior, habitual practices, habitual norms which we keep on performing on a day-to-day basis, and they accept they basically illustrate the acceptable norms of behavior for a social system in terms of a routine or in terms of a habitual day-to-day practice. So people follow such practices collectively, and the habitual nature gets transmitted from one generation to another. Then we have rituals. Rituals are prescribed processes and procedures for conduct of social or religious rites. They are in the form of rites, ceremonies, and which could be symbolic in nature. So rituals are essentially to do with social rites or to do with religious rites, and they basically are established rites or ceremonies or proceedings which have some kind of a symbolism attached to them. And finally, there are laws. Laws are which are principles, they are rules, they are regulations that are either formally sanctioned or informally adhered to in the form of norms. So either there is a formal authority behind them in terms of a political element, or in terms of a ruler or a government or a constitution, etc. So something very formal, either prescribed by law, either prescribed by a political authority or a ruler or a constitutional element, and it is then supported by the judicial authority of a particular country. Laws could also be informal. Laws could also be informal, which will be referred to as a norm, which is informally accepted and adhered to by people in the society. So they manifest themselves often in the form of conventions, which are mutually agreed upon rules or regulations which people in a society have to agree to. So such laws are universally, whether formal or informal, are universally applied across the country or across the society, and either they could be in the form of written rules and regulations which are more formal, and non-adherence of these written rules and regulations can often lead to punishment or legal action from the judiciary. On the other hand, the informal are not written, they are more understood and self-accepted by people of a social system, and they agree to follow these certain rules, certain informal rules as do's and don'ts that have a bearing on their day-to-day behavior and on their day-to-day general and specific acts of behavior. So these are the various components of culture. Now let us come to how do you measure culture, or what do you mean by measurement of culture. So culture can be measured through the use of many techniques, some of which can be projective tests or attitude measurement tests and techniques, or content analysis, or consumer fieldwork, or value measurement instruments. So let us discuss these various components, about these various tools and techniques by which we can measure culture. So we'll start with projective tests. They are basically meant to measure underlying traits or fears or anxieties or attitudes, personalities and motivations. People reveal their orientations towards values, their mates, their customs, traditions and rituals. So people are shown certain cartoons or certain characters or ink blots, or given incomplete sentences and paragraphs to complete and comprehend them. So the manner in which they behave, the gestures, the body language, the tone of the voice and other reactions of the body are readily noted, and such tests basically pertain more to do with personality and motivation. So through these projective tests, people get an idea into, the researcher gets an idea into the orientations of people towards cultural values, myths, customs, traditions, rituals and the like. The two commonly used projective tests are the thematic apperception test called TAT and the Rorschach ink block test. So all these tests basically use pictures, images, cartoons, ink blocks and incomplete sentences and paragraphs to basically understand, to use them, and they give them to respondents and they ask them to interpret them. So through their responses, through the responses of the people, through their body gestures, through their tone, through their language and through the expressions, you get to know about the underlying motives, about the underlying personality traits, as also the fears, the anxieties, the attitudes and their overall bearing on cultural issues, values, rituals, customs, traditions, etc. You come to know that. So this is called a projective test. Then you have attitude measurement tests and techniques. So there are a lot of techniques which are used, there are a lot of tools which are available to measure attitudes towards objects or towards people or towards situation, and they again reflect people's attitudes and orientations towards cultural values, myths, customs, traditions and rituals. Then you have the content analysis, which basically focuses on the examination of verbal, written and non-verbal and pictorial communications or compositions through assessment about the society and its culture, as well as the evolutionary socio-cultural changes can be judged through an examination of such verbal, non-verbal, written and pictorial compositions and communication. So, content analysis can also be used. You try to assess the verbal, the non-verbal, the written and the pictorial compositions and communication, and through an assessment of that, you try to study the cultural norms, the cultural patterns and the evolutionary social cultural changes that are being brought about. Consumer fieldwork. So, fieldwork may also be conducted on consumers to observe their behavior and to draw out generalizations about their values, their customs, their myths, their beliefs, their traditions, their rituals, etc. Such generalizations, of course, are clearly visible in the cases of store shopping behavior, where a researcher can basically observe a shopper, a consumer, about how he is behaving, his bodily expressions, his facial expressions, his bodily gestures, his overall body, the verbal and non-verbal language can basically be observed and recorded, and observationals can be drawn about their values, their myths, their behaviors, their customs and their traditions. Sometimes the observation is very passive, the researcher is just being a passive observer. Sometimes he assumes a more active role and he begins to interact with the shoppers or with the consumers, and through verbal communication and through mix with the non-verbal communication, he gets an idea about the behavior of the shopper or the consumer, and again that behavior also could be related to his customs, traditions, rituals, myths and traditions, values, etc. Sometimes focus group interviews will also give insights, personal interviews also give insights into underlying motives, into underlying traits, fears, anxieties, thought processes, and ultimately it has a bearing on your values, on your myths, on your rituals, on your customs, on your traditions, on your value system. Finally, value measurement instruments. Value measurement instruments can also be used. We have discussed in the previous session a few of the lifestyle measurement tools and techniques, where one of the most popular ones is VALS, or the values and lifestyle analysis. There is another one which is called the list of values, or the Rokik value survey. So these scales, they measure values by means of a questionnaire. Respondents are asked a large number of questions which relate to their opinions about issues like peace, freedom and independence, comfort, convenience, ambition, success, etc. And through interpretation of such responses and through observation of the behavior of people, researchers get an idea about the dominant and the underlying values of the society. So such values definitely have a bearing on the general patterns of behavior and the specific consumption behavior which people have in the marketplace. Now let us come to subculture. So while culture is defined as the personality of a society, it is not entirely homogeneous in nature. So if you see the country, not everybody in the country will have the similar customs or traditions or rituals or value systems, or not all of them will have the same eating patterns and the same dressing styles and dressing patterns. There is always a change. So while culture is defined as the sum total of a society's personality, it is not essentially homogeneous in nature. Not all people in the social system will talk the same language, or will have the same customs and traditions and values, or will have the same kinds of rituals and ceremonies, or will have the same kind of eating patterns or dressing patterns. There will definitely be a change. So within a culture, what we find is subgroups of similarity, subgroups where people within the group are more homogeneous, more similarity, and across the subgroups are more different from other and more heterogeneous. So every society is composed of smaller subgroups, homogeneous within and heterogeneous outside, and these smaller subgroups which are homogeneous within, similar within, and heterogeneous outside are referred to as subcultures. They put together different kinds of subcultures will make a complex society. So these subgroups or these subunits are called subcultures. People within a subculture will be more distinctive with respect to their values, beliefs, customs and traditions, and will share it more strongly, act it more as a binding force than people from other subcultures. So a single culture can be broken up into separate subcultures. A subculture is one which is defined as a culture that is not dominant in its society. So as consumers from various subcultures, we are very different to one another. We have different values, different beliefs, different customs and traditions, and all of this also gets reflected in our purchase patterns and our consumption behavior. So that is the reason why the study of subculture becomes very relevant. So while we talk broadly of culture, within culture we have differences in different groups of people, and within group people are more similar, so they comprise one subculture, and they are different from people from another subculture. So the kind of values, customs, traditions will vary across these subgroups. Similarly, the general and specific acts of behavior, the do's and don'ts, will also vary across these groups, and more specific to consumption patterns, the kind of clothes we wear, the kind of food we eat, the kind of the shopping orientations we have, the kind of the shopping process we will undergo in terms of the kind of products we will buy, or the kind of prices we will be ready to pay, or the kind of places we will like to frequent as a shopper, or the kind of appeal that binds us most in the form of a message appeal. All of this will vary across people of subculture. So coming to types of subculture, the more important subcultural categories are in terms of nationality, geographical location, religion, race, caste, gender and age. So from a marketer's perspective, these could be studied as different market segments which need to be studied very carefully before deciding on the marketing mix for a segment. So nationality, while we are all Asians, we are distinct with respect to culture and different in terms of language, customs and traditions. So we are classified as Indians or Burmese or Nepalese or Pakistanis or Ceylonese. Similarly, with geographical location, within a country there will be different, we will be different across geography, across climatic conditions, across region and terrains, and across density of population. So people will have a regional affinity and identification, and that gets reflected in the kind of eating patterns or the dressing styles or the kind of interest that they pursue. So they constitute a distinct subculture, and people across subcultures will be very different. Like for example, a North Indian is very different to a South Indian. Religion, again, people exhibit differences when it comes to religion. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Parsis, all of them are different from one another. They have different values, different beliefs, customs and traditions. And as consumers also, we make product choices or purchase choices or brand choices that are actually influenced by dictates of our religious leaders or of our scriptures and holy books. So the kind of products we buy, the kind of services we prefer, the kind of brands that we buy, the kind of price that we are ready to pay, the kind of needs and wants and the resultant priorities and preference that we have are all impacted by our holy books, our scriptures, our religious texts and our leaders. So in fact, many of the products are associated with some form of symbolism, some form of rituals, and for example, as per Islam, non-vegetarian food must be halal, and this itself comprises a huge segment that marketers must address to when they are thinking about crossing national boundaries and catering to people of other countries. So we are very different when it comes to religion, and religion itself can be used as a basis of subculture. Then race and caste, across within a particular religion, we get segregated in terms of race and caste. Cultures will vary across states, will across race will vary across race and caste. So Jats or Rajputs, Pathans, Yadavs, they all are different from one another. They belong to different castes and communities, and so as subcultures they are very different, and they will impact again the buying and consumption patterns. Gender gender again, the male and female again have a different, they act as two different, can be used as a basis for subculture, because gender roles have an impact on acts of behavior. Gender constitutes an important component of a cultural subgroup. So, males and females across all cultures are designed different traits and characteristics that make them masculine or feminine. So, they also perform different kinds of roles as two distinct groups. It is true today that gender roles have got blurred, especially we have been discussing this in terms of the roles and statuses that men and women have in the family today. Nevertheless, the men also still in some cultures where we see men performing certain kinds of roles and responsibilities and women performing another. Age can also be used as a basis. Infants, kids, teenagers, adolescents, adults and aged may all be looked as distinct subgroups. They have different values and beliefs, and this has an impact on their priorities in life. Daily lifestyles, activities, interests, opinions, hobbies, fashion and accessories, food and diet, all of these receive varying priorities across age and across various subgroups. So that is how we say that these various subgroups are different, and they could be treated as different part of different cultures and subcultures. So with this we come to an end of our discussion on culture and subculture with references for further reading: Loudon and Della Bitta, Peter and Olson, Schiffman and Canuck, and Wells and Prensky. So these are the books which one should be referring to. The frequently asked questions. Question 1, what do we mean by culture? Discuss the characteristic of culture. And question 2, what are the various methods by which culture can be measured? Self-evaluation test, section 8, true false. 1, culture is society's personality, unique in itself and differentiated from others. Is it true or false? So this is a true statement. 2, a single culture can be broken up into various social classes. So it is a true or a false statement. This is a false statement. Single culture can be broken up into various social classes. Yeah, so let's come to a self-evaluation test and quiz, section 8, true false. 1, culture is a society's personality, unique in itself and differentiated from others. So is it a true or a false statement? This is a true statement. Question 2, a single culture can be broken into various social classes. So is it a true or a false statement? This is a false statement. A single culture can be broken up into various subcultures. It is not social classes, but it is subcultures. Section B, fill in the blanks. 1, the process of learning one's native culture is known as dash, while the process of learning a new or a foreign culture is known as dash. So the process of learning one's native culture is known as enculturation, while the process of learning a new or a foreign culture is known as acculturation. Question 2, MNCs who desire to enter foreign markets should carefully study and understand the culture of such countries. They should go through a process of dash. They should go through a process of acculturation. 3, dash tests can be traced to the psychoanalytic psychology, which argue that human beings have conscious and unconscious attitudes, motivations and personalities that are hidden and unknown from conscious awareness. So dash test, it is projective tests. Short answers: define culture in the context of consumer behavior. 2, mention the characteristics of culture. 3, what are the forms in which cultural learning takes place. 4, mention the various components of culture. And 5, mention commonly used value measurement instruments. So this is what brings us to an end of our session on culture and subculture. We should be continuing with the rest of the portion on culture, subculture and cross culture in the next session. Thank you.